Tartars, the Scourge of God. The causes of Tartar invasion? Islam was confronted with another danger in the 7th century, unparalleled in the annals of the world, which was about to wipe it out of existence. This was the invasion of the wild and savage hordes of the Tartars who issued forth from the Mongolian steppes and overpowered almost the whole of the Islamic world with a lightning speed. The immediate cause of the Mongol invasion can be attributed to a grievous mistake of Ala-ud-Din Muhammad, the Shah of Khwarizm. A body of traders who had arrived from Mongolia was put to death, and when Chengiz Khan deputed an embassy to inquire into the reasons for it, Muhammad replied by killing the envoy too. On receiving the news of this outrage upon international courtesy, the Mongol Khakan Chengiz Khan loosened the whirlwind of savagery upon the world of Islam. However, if one were to look into the moral behavior and attitudes of ancient nations, particularly those relating to the Bani Israel as well as their destruction and massacre, demolition and sacrilege of Jerusalem, and the reasons therefore described in the Quran, one can clearly see with the insight provided by the scripture into the nature of historical process, that the reason for converting the Islamic world into a vast charnel house was not a solitary act of cruelty on the part of a reckless and haughty sovereign. As the Quran tells us, it was certainly not due to the mistake of a single individual that the storm of death and destruction burst forth on the entire world of Islam. If we were to cast a glance over the religious, moral, social, and political conditions of the Muslim peoples in those days, there would be no difficulty in finding out the reason for this calamity. Such a survey would amply bear out that the carnage did not take place all of a sudden. It had deeper and far-reaching reasons than those narrated hitherto by the historians. We shall have to look for these reasons into the political situation and the social condition of Muslim society over a century or more prior to the Mongol invasion. After the death of Salah-ud-Din in 589 AH, the vast empire carved out by him split up into several independent principalities and kingdoms headed by his sons or other successors. Like many other founders of the empires, his successors did not possess the talent of their progenitor, and what was more, they continued to fight each other for a fairly long time. Some of these even did not hesitate to seek the assistance of the Crusaders against their own brethren. The whole of the Islamic world was in fact in a state of chaos. Nowhere was to be found peace and tranquility. A moral and social disintegration was at work, which was clearly visible in the rapidly deteriorating political situation. The Crusaders were again making inroads into the Muslim territories and had recaptured the lands emancipated from their clutches by Salah-ud-Din. All those factors had already contributed to the repeated famines and epidemics. A fertile country like Egypt was so devastated by the fratricidal warfare between Al-Malik al-Adil and his nephew Al-Malik al-Afzal that when the floods in Nile failed in 597 AH, the country was overtaken by such a severe famine that the people had to take resort to cannibalism. Death stalked over the land, killing the people in such large numbers that the dead had to be buried without shrouds. The annalist Abu Shama relates that Sultan al-Malik al-Adil provided shrouds for 220,000 dead bodies in a single month. People began to take the dogs and human flesh without any feeling of revulsion. Innumerable children were eaten away. Ibn Kathir writes that a stage came when the children and youth of tender age were all eaten up, and people began to kill one another to satisfy their hunger. These were grim reminders of God calling people to a sincere penitence for their sins and mending their ways. The ravages of famine and pestilence were followed by a severe and widespread earthquake, which hit the region covering Syria, Asia Minor, and Iraq. The devastation and destruction wrought by the earthquake can be judged from the fact that in the town of Nablus and its surrounding district, 20,000 people were crushed under the fallen houses. Another historian writes in Mirat al-Zaman that 1,100,000 people died as a result of this earthquake. On the one hand, these natural calamities were visiting the Islamic world with unwelcome regularity, and on the other, fratricidal feuds and forays were continuing unabated. In 601 AH, the two chiefs belonging to the same family, Qatada Husaini of Makkah and Salim Husaini of Medina, were locked up in a hotly contested battle. In 603 AH, the deadly feuds between the Ghurids of Afghanistan and the ruler of Khwarizm flared up, which encouraged the Muslims to waste their energy and power by shedding each other's blood. This was the state of affairs on the one side, while the Christendom had inflamed another crusade, on the other, barely 2 years after the death of Salah ud-Din, and landed its forces on the Syrian coast in 604 AH. The rulers of Al Jazeera were secretly in league with the Franks in 607 AH, while Damietta in Egypt, a city of considerable military importance, had fallen to the Crusaders in 616 AH. In the metropolis of Islam, Baghdad, the magnificence and splendor of the Caliph's court, copied from the etiquettes and ceremonials observed by the Iranian and Byzantine emperors, had touched the summit of extravagance. It is difficult to imagine the wealth amassed by such personal servants of the caliphs as pages, cupbearers, attendants of wardrobe, who normally entered the service merely as slaves. The annual income from the property acquired by Alauddin al-Tabrasi al-Zari, a slave purchased by the Caliph al-Zahir, is reported to have been as much as 300,000 dinars. The house built by him in Baghdad was conspicuous for its size and beauty. Similar was the case with other state officials, Mujahid ud-Din Aibek al-Salah Abdul Ghani, to name only a few. The former had an annual income of 5 lakh dinars, while the latter, although an illiterate man, lived like a prince. Analysts have left staggering accounts of their lavish expenditure on the marriages of their sons and daughters. On the other hand, the teachers of the celebrated Madarsa al-Mustansariya were doled out such paltry sums which bore no comparison to the wages paid to the meanest of the state officials. The most erudite scholars and professors did not get more than 12 dinars a month, while the servant of al-Sharabi, a grandee of the Abbasid regime, could spend 4,000 dinars on a marriage and pay another 3,000 as the price of a bird brought for him from Mosul. The royal processions of the caliphs on the occasion of Eid and to mark the anniversary of their succession to throne were seized as an opportunity for ostentatious display of royal pomp and pageantry. The whole of Baghdad came out to witness these processions in a mood, free and easy, amusing and entertaining itself, and oblivious of even obligatory congregational prayers. In 640 AH, the royal procession taken out on the occasion of Eid terminated after the nightfall, with the result that most of the people witnessing the procession performed the Eid prayers just before midnight. Again, in 644 AH, a large number of people missed the prayers on the occasion of Eid al-Adha and performed the same at the time of sunset. The usual mode of making obeisance to the Caliph was to bow almost to the ground or touch the ground with one's nose, but nobody even felt in it anything opposed to the teachings of the Sharia or degrading to his independent and manly character. Confiscation of private property had become a common affair. Illegal gratification by officials was widely prevalent. Immodesty and grossness of conduct was on the increase. The Batanites, charlatans, and swindlers were basking in sunshine. Everyone seemed to be after wealth. Love of music had grown almost into a craze. In short, the common pursuits of the people and the social and moral disintegration of the society threw a lurid light on the state of chaos then prevailing in the Muslim world. This was the time when the Mongols were devastating Turkestan and Iran and were casting a covetous glance over Baghdad. The year 626 AH began, writes Ibn Kathir, with the indecisive yet sanguinary battles between the monarchs of the House of Ayyubids. Such a state of chaos prevailed in Baghdad, the center of caliphate. From 640 AH to 643 AH, no arrangements could be made by the caliph for sending out Hajj parties, nor was the covering for Kaaba sent by the caliph. For 21 days, the walls of the holy shrine remained without a cover, which was taken as an ill omen by the people. Ahmad Abul Abbas succeeded his father, Caliph al-Mustadi, in 575 AH under the title of Al-Nasir ud Din-Illah. He had had an opportunity to rule for 46 years. His reign was the longest one ever enjoyed by any Abbasid caliph yet, perhaps. It was also the darkest of all the regimes of the House of Abbasids. Historians have severely criticized his regime for tyranny and maladministration. Writes Ibn al-Athir, he was a tyrant who ill-treated the populace. Iraq was a devastated land during his regime. Its population migrated to neighboring countries, and their possessions were confiscated by the caliph. He gave contradictory orders, rescinded the orders given by him a day earlier. Being too much interested in sports and pastime, he had prescribed a special uniform which could be put on only by those permitted to take part in gymnastics and athletic sports. His orders so severely curtailed the sports that these activities practically came to an end in Iraq. His interest in entertainment had grown almost into a craze. Iranians accuse him of inviting the Mongols to attack the Muslim territories and hatching a conspiracy for the same. Al-Nasir Din-Illah died in 622 AH. And Mustansir billah, from 623 to 640, ascended the throne. He was a just, mild, benevolent, and pious ruler, recalling the right-guided caliphs. But unfortunately, he did not get enough time to reform the administration. He was succeeded by his son Mustasim Billah in 640 AH. He too was a pious and just sovereign who never touched wine nor indulged in immodest acts. He had committed the Quran to memory and observed fast on the Mondays and Thursdays, in addition to those during the months of Ramadan and Rajab. He is reported to be punctual in the performance of prayers, but according to Ibn al-Athir, he was too mild and miserly and also lacked foresight. In 642 AH, a man by the name of Mu'ayyid ud-Din Muhammad ibn Alqami was appointed as prime minister by the Caliph Mustasim. Disorders and disturbances were a source of constant trouble in Baghdad, especially when the Sunnis and Shias quarreled in 655 AH. It is reported that in these riots, the Shia quarters, including those of the relatives of Ibn al-Qami, were plundered, which led him to seek revenge from the Sunnis. Although the danger of the Mongol invasion was hovering over Baghdad, a great reduction was made in the armed forces on the advice of Ibn al-Qami. The number of cavalry was reduced to mere 10,000. Their allowances and promotions were withheld. The disbanded soldiers were directed to take to trade and husbandry, with the result that many of them were later on seen begging alms in the bazaars and in front of the mosques. Al-Mustasim was personally a man of unimpeachable character. He also wanted to reform administration and bring peace and prosperity in his realm, but unfortunately he lacked the courage, zeal, and ability of the founders of empires, which alone could have saved the situation by infusing a breath of new life in the then tottering society and the administration. It has happened more than once that the last monarch of any ruling dynasty was just and wise, virtuous and humane, but the degeneration of social and political order had reached the point in his time where its only natural outcome was final decay and crumbling down of that dynasty. This was the case with Mustasim too, whom Providence had chosen for the badge of infamy, although he was better than most of his predecessors, and had also a desire to set right the fastly deteriorating situation. It is undoubtedly true that a group of people, pure in spirit and righteous in conduct, were there teaching and preaching in the mosques and seminaries of Baghdad, but the affluent and those in authority had become so corrupt that an analyst of that age, Abul Hasan Khazraji, had to describe the conditions prevailing in his time in these words: "The desire to acquire estates and effects has become a craze with these people who never think of the community's welfare. They are so engrossed in feathering their own nests that it can never be deemed as a rightful course. The officials of the government are all tyrants who are obsessed with the idea of amassing as much wealth as possible. This is the most dangerous state of affairs, for the government can coexist with apostasy, but never with tyranny." In the eastern part of the Islamic world, the kingdom of Khwarizm, raised towards the end of the 5th century of the Muslim era on the ruins of the Seljuk Empire, held sway over almost the entire Islamic territories, excluding the principalities of Saljukid sultans over parts of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Hejaz and Asia Minor, and that of the Ghorids in Afghanistan. Sultan Ala-ud-Din Muhammad Khwarizm Shah, from 596 to 617, was one of the most powerful Muslim monarchs, or perhaps the greatest sovereign of his day. Harold Lamb writes in his famous book, Chengiz Khan. In the center of Islam, Muhammad Shah of Khwarizm had enthroned himself as warlord. His domain extended from India to Baghdad and from the Sea of Aral to the Persian Gulf. Except for the Seljuk Turks, victors over the Crusaders, and the rising Mamluk dynasty in Egypt, his authority was supreme. He was the emperor, and the Caliph who quarreled with him but might not deny him was restricted to the spiritual authority of a pope. Muslim historians have not mentioned any noticeable personal laxity in the character or moral behavior of Khwarizm Shah. On the other hand, they speak of him as a brave and chivalrous ruler, just and pious, but there is no denying the fact that he spent his prowess and capabilities in subjugating the Muslim kingdoms around his dominions. In the northwest of his territory, he forced the Seljukid to retreat to the farthest end while he restrained the westward ambitions of the Ghurids by subjugating Khorasan, Mazandaran, Rinnan, Ghazni, and Transoxiana. These unending wars of Khwarizm Shah had nevertheless worn out his troops, who had to strain every nerve in achieving the conquests they had had so far. Apart from the war phobia normally created by the continuous warfare over a long period of time, the conquest of the most fertile and industrially developed areas had brought to the capital of Khwarizm Shah all that toil and labor could produce, along with the attendant vices of opulence and luxury. It is difficult to find any detailed account of these social ills in the annals of the time, which are mostly concerned with the descriptions of kings and emperors. Unfortunately, however, the treatises and sermons, monographs and discourses of the saints and preachers, which would have thrown a lurid light on the subject, were all destroyed by the Mongolian avalanche. There is hardly any reason for attributing the following statement of Harold Lamb to his religious prejudice or exaggeration. It was a martial world, appreciative of song with an ear not unmusical, a world beset by inward throes, slave-ridden, wealth-gathering, and more than a little addicted to vice and intrigue. It left the management of its affairs to extortionists and its women to the custody of eunuchs, and its conscience to the keeping of Allah. The sultans of Khwarizm made the same fatal mistake which was committed by the Moors in Spain, an unpardonable blunder under the divine law of retribution governing the historical process. They set about, body and soul, to extend and strengthen the bounds of their domain and subjugate their enemies. But they never tried to diffuse the message of God and enlist adherents to it from the neighboring lands, which constituted a world different from their own. Quite apart from the religious fervor which should have diverted their energies towards this imperative task, common sense as well as political foresight, too, dictated the same course which would have won over a vast but hostile population to their side, and thus saved themselves, as well as other Muslims, from the tragic fate which was soon to engulf all of them. Such were the conditions when the Mongols issued forth from the steppes of Mongolia under Chengiz Khan and swooped down upon Iran and Turkestan, the eastern part of the Islamic world, like the scourge of God. By 656 AH, the Mongols had reached the center of Islam Baghdad, converting it into a shamble fulfilling the Quranic dictum. And guard yourselves against a chastisement which cannot fall exclusively on those of you who are wrongdoers, and know that Allah is severe in punishment. Folly of Khwarizm Shah. Chengiz Khan had communicated with Khwarizm Shah to open up trade between the two mighty empires. Khwarizm Shah agreed, and the trade began. The trade, however, came to an abrupt ending. Lamb, whose accounts agree with those left by Muslim historians, wrote, "But the Mongols' experiment with trade came to an abrupt end. A caravan of several hundred merchants from Karakoram was seized by one, Inaljuk, governor of Otrar, a frontier citadel belonging to the Shah. Inaljuk reported to his master that spies were among the merchants, which may very well have been the case. Muhammad Shah, without considering the matter overmuch, sent to his governor an order to slay the merchants. All of them, accordingly, were put to death. This, in due time, was reported to Genghis Khan, who dispatched envoys at once to the Shah to protest. Muhammad saw fit to slay the chief of the envoys and burn off the beards of the others. When the survivors of his embassy returned to Genghis Khan, the master of the Gobi went to a mountain to meditate upon the matter. The slaying of a Mongol envoy could not go unpunished. Tradition required revenge for the wrong inflicted. There cannot be two suns in the heavens, the Khan said, or two Khakans upon the earth. the Tartar invasion. Thus, the storm burst in 616 AH. Bukhara was first razed to the ground and its inhabitants put to the sword. Samarkand was reduced to ashes and its entire population passed under the sword. Other important and populous cities like Ray, Hamadan, Zanjan, Kazım, Marv, Nishapur met the same fate. The forces of Khwarizm Shah, the most powerful Muslim sovereign of his day, were simply swept away by the tempest of the Mongol army. Khwarizm Shah was himself hunted from place to place by the Tartars with ruthless pertinence. Muhammad Khwarizm Shah ultimately took refuge in an unknown island in the Caspian Sea, where he died broken-hearted, alone, and abandoned. Khwarizm Shah had already dismembered the independent Islamic kingdoms of Iran and Turkestan, and therefore none had remained in the east to check the onslaught of the Mongols after his defeat. The Muslims were so seized with the terror of the Mongols that often a lone Tartar attacked 100 of them, but none had the heart to defend himself, and all of them were killed by the Tartar without being opposed by a single Muslim. Once a Mongol woman dressed as a man plundered a house and filled all its inmates except a captive. It was only after this that the captive somehow came to know that the murderer was a woman, and then he could muster his courage to kill her. It often happened that a Mongol caught hold of a Muslim and asked him to wait till he brought a saber to slaughter him, and this poor man did not have the courage to run away in the absence of the Mongol. The invasion of the Tartars was one of the greatest of calamities and the most tenable of visitations, of which there is no parallel in the annals of the world. The Tartars put to the sword all men, women, and children, cut open the bellies of the pregnant women, and trampled the babies to death. Verily unto God do we belong, and unto him shall we return. There is no power, no might but from Allah, the Most High, the Great. Sack of Baghdad. In 656 AH, Tatars advanced towards Baghdad, killing everyone that came in their way, setting fire to every habitation, and trampling into dust whatever they could not possess. The metropolis of Islam, celebrated throughout the world as the center of civilization, learning, and crafts, was reduced to ashes. The sack of Baghdad is too agonizing and lengthy to be detailed here. The accounts given by the contemporary historians include some eyewitness accounts of the carnage and atrocities committed by the Mongols. Ibn al-Athir writes, "The horrors of pillage and slaughter lasted 40 days, and after the carnage was over, the metropolis and beautiful city of the world was so devastated that only a few people could be seen here and there. All the streets and markets were strewn with dead bodies. Heaps of corpses were to be found like small mounds from place to place. After the rain, the dead bodies began to rot, giving out a disagreeable smell of the putrid flesh. And then, a deadly pestilence ravaged the town, which spread as far as the land of Syria. Innumerable people died as a result of this epidemic. The ravages of a terrible famine and pestilence and the rising prices reigned over the city thereafter." Tajuddin ibn al-Subki gives his own account of the barbarous acts of Mongols. Halaku received the Caliph, al-Mudasim, in a tent, while Ibn al-Qami called the doctors of religion and other notables of the city to be a witness to the agreement between Halaku and the Caliph. When they reached the Mongol camp, all were passed under the sword. They were called one by one in a tent and beheaded until none amongst the chiefs and counselors of the Caliph remained alive. It was commonly believed that if the blood of the Caliph fell on the ground, some great calamity would overtake the world. Halaku was therefore hesitant, but Nasir-ud-Din Tusi intervened to suggest that the problem could easily be solved. The Caliph should be killed, he suggested, in a way that his blood doesn't fall on the ground. The Caliph was accordingly rolled in a carpet and then beaten to death. The general massacre continued in Baghdad for more than a month. Only those who were able to find a hiding place could save themselves. Halaku then ordered to count the dead, who numbered 1,800,000. Christians were asked to take bacon and wine openly. Although it was the month of Ramadan, the Muslims of Baghdad were compelled to participate in these drinking bouts. Wine was sprinkled in the mosques and the call for prayer was prohibited. Nothing so despicable had happened since the foundations of Baghdad were laid. The city had come under the heathen rule for the first time and had never before undergone such a humiliation. In spite of all its vices and weaknesses, Baghdad was the metropolis of Islam, a center of learning and a city of mosques and shrines, saints and preachers. Its destruction made the heart of every Muslim bleed. The heart-rending account of its ruin was rendered by many poets into songs of mourning. From Baghdad, the Mongol hordes marched on to Halab, Aleppo, sacked the city, and turned to Damascus. They captured Damascus in 658 AH. The Christian inhabitants of the city came out with presents to greet the conquerors. Ibn Kathir, who belonged to Damascus, has portrayed the joy of Christians and the helplessness of the Muslims in these words. The Christians came back by the gate of Toma, carrying the cross over their heads and shouting slogans. They were praising Christianity and openly disparaging Islam and the Muslims. They had flasks of wine from which they sprinkled the liquor in front of the mosques and on the faces of Muslims they happened to pass by, ordering the Muslims to pay homage to their emblem. Muslims could not restrain themselves for long and gathered in large numbers and pushed them back to the Cathedral of Mary, where a Christian clergy was delivering a speech praising Christianity and denigrating Islam and its followers. Egyptian encounter. After the fall of Syria, the Mongols wanted to carry their arms to Egypt, which was the only Muslim country still out of their reach. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Malik al-Muzaffar Saif ud-Din Tatars, knew that his country would be the next target of the Mongols, and also that it would be difficult to hold off those savages if they were allowed to make adequate preparations for invading his lands. He, therefore, decided to attack the Mongols in Syria before they were able to consolidate their power. The forces of Egypt accordingly met the Mongols at Ain Jalut, a town below Nazareth in Palestine, on the 25th of Ramadan, 658 AH, under the command of Baburs, who afterwards became the sovereign of Egypt. Unlike previous battles, the Muslims met the Mongols in a hotly contested battle and drove back the stream of savage hordes. The Egyptians pursued the defeated Mongols, slaughtering and capturing a large number of them, eastward beyond the Euphrates. Sultan Baburs defeated the Tatars in many fierce battles after the Battle of Ain Jalut, and thus disproved the proverb that the Tatars were invincible. Some time passed. After the death of Genghis Khan, his dominion split. At a time when Muslim Ummah appeared to be at its low, there were Muslims who were pursuing all the 4 requirements to avoid loss as given in the Holy Quran, chapter 103. The tide turned in a way that couldn't be imagined. Tatars started accepting Islam, not just a few, but in large numbers, especially the princes and rulers. Tughluq Prince and a Persian. The encounter. Tughluq Timur Khan, who lived from 1347 to 1363, a prince, is said to have owed his conversion to Islam to a holy man from Bukhara by the name Sheikh Jamal al-Din. This sheikh, in company with a number of travelers, had unwittingly trespassed on the game preserves of the prince, who ordered them to be bound hand and foot and brought before him. In reply to the prince's angry question how they had dared interfere with his hunting, the sheikh pleaded that they were strangers and were quite unaware that they were trespassing on forbidden ground. Learning that they were Persians, the prince said that a dog was worth more than a Persian. "Yes," replied the sheikh, "if we had not the true faith, we would indeed be worse than the dogs." Struck with his reply, the Khan ordered this bold Persian to be brought before him on his return from hunting. When the prince came back from hunting, he took the sheikh aside and asked him to explain what he meant by those words and what was faith. The sheikh then set before him the doctrine of Islam with such fervor and zeal that the heart of the Khan that before had been hard as a stone was melted like wax, and so terrible a picture did the holy man draw of the state of unbelief that the prince was convinced of the blindness of his own errors. The prince reflected and said, "Were I now to make a profession of the faith of Islam, I would not be able to lead my subjects into the true path. But bear with me a little, and when I have entered into the possession of the kingdom of my forefathers, come to me again." For the empire of Chagatai had by this time been broken up into a number of petty princedoms, and it was many years before Tughluq Timur succeeded in uniting under his sway the whole empire as before. Meanwhile, Sheikh Jamal al-Din had returned to his home, where he fell dangerously ill. When at the point of death he said to his son, Rashid al-Din, Tughluq Timur will one day become a great monarch. Fail not to go and salute him in my name, and fearlessly remind him of the promise he made me. Some years later, when Tughluq Timur had re-won the empire of his fathers, Rashid al-Din made his way to the camp of the Khan to fulfill the last wishes of his father. But in spite of all his efforts, he could not gain an audience with the Khan. At length he devised the following expedient. One day in the early morning, he began to chant the call to prayers, close to the Khan's tent. Enraged at having his slumbers disturbed in this way, the prince ordered him to be brought into his presence, whereupon Rashid al-Din delivered his father's message. Tughluq Khan was not unmindful of his promise and said, "Ever since I ascended the throne, I have had it on my mind that I made that promise. But the person to whom I gave the pledge never came. Now you are welcome." He then repeated the profession of faith and became a Muslim. It is reported that the day Tughluq Khan accepted Islam, 160,000 persons cut off their hair and accepted Islam. On that morning, the sun of bounty rose out of the east of divine favor and effaced the dark night of unbelief. In many ways, Muslims were able to win over to their faith the savage hordes who had destroyed their centers of culture. By slow degrees, Islam thus began to emerge out of the ruins of its former ascendancy and took its place again as a dominant faith after more than a century of depression. Thus began another era of rise of the Muslim Ummah, and the story continues. And history repeats itself in many ways, colors and fashions. True dominance and success lies only in following the footsteps of the prophetic model. Severity of loss lies in the severity of weaknesses in any of the 4 mandatory requirements given in the Holy Quran, chapter 103, the requirements of faith, righteous deeds, advising and commanding the truth, and advising and commanding to perseverance. The strength of the presence of the effort for these 4 at personal, family, community, city, state, and world level measures the strength of success with the will and help of God Almighty. So look around, find people with these 4 qualities and be with them. But wait, you may not truly find anyone unless you find these 4 qualities in your own self. That is, I will not find any such person unless I find these 4 qualities in my own self. Faith, righteous deeds, advice and conformity on truth, advice and conformity on perseverance as given to mankind by God Almighty through his Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. Remember, Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, said, "Whoever amongst you sees an evil, he must change it with his hand. If he is unable to do so, then with his tongue, and if he is unable to do so, then with his heart, and that is the weakest form of faith. So let the faith sprout." In me and you,